All right, welcome back to the Blue Ridge Breakdown. We are joined once again, our first returning guest, Professor Harvey J, who is the author of over a dozen books and a professor emeritus at University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, Ben and Joyce Rosenberg Professor of Democracy and Justice Studies, and so much more. Most pertinent to today's conversation, the author of the book Thomas Paine and the Promise of America, and where we kind of, I'm going to set us up just a little bit, and then you can take it however you want in a moment. First of all, thanks for joining us
Happy,
again.
happy to do so.
You're one, like I said, our first returning guest, so thank you. And where we left off was kind of, when we rushed to the end, was Thomas Paine had gone over to Europe to raise funds to build an iron bridge. And while he's there, the French Revolution bursts out, outbreaks, for lack of, I think that's the best way to describe how a revolution
Yeah.
occurs. And from there, where do we go?
Well, here's the thing. I think where we need to go in this is first to ask, why is it that after Paine's death in 1809, conservatives of every sort, the religious conservatives, the political conservatives, the economic conservatives, in other words, the well-endowed rich, okay, all of these kinds of folks, as I think I may have said last time, the powerful, the pious, the privileged, the propertied, they all wanted to suppress the memory of Thomas Paine. And the question is why? What did he do that would lead there? Well, in part, it had to do with the fact that he really did offer a radical vision of a new United States. I mean, this is the guy who not only called for independence and changed a colonial rebellion into a war of independence, he called for democracy, which was not the kind of thing that the elites ever really have wanted. Okay. And he did so in a very direct way. His idea was that ordinary people could govern themselves. Okay. And they didn't need overlords, they didn't need bosses, they didn't need bishops. Okay. So that's okay. That in itself made him kind of an enemy of the powerful. But what happened is while he was in France, he 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 was part of the revolutionary movement. He wrote Rights of Man, which was his answer to Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, which was an effort on the part of Burke, the conservative, to take down revolutionaries wherever they might pop up. But how dare they try to overthrow generations, if not centuries, of tradition and hierarchy and so on. But especially Burke was concerned that the British peoples, English, Scottish, and Welsh, and Irish, might themselves try to overthrow the political order of king and aristocrats in Britain. Okay. So, but Paine didn't stop there. As I think I mentioned in the last episode, Paine was a deist. Okay, he was very well versed in the Bible, and he was decidedly imbued with Quaker values. From his mother, the Bible, and from his father, the Quaker values. But he was a deist, and a deist is one who believes in God. It's not an atheist, believes in God, but would make the case and by the way, he was not the only deist of the day. In fact, historians have had to distinguish between deists and militant deists. Deists,
Okay.
almost all of the leading founding fathers were deists. Not all, but almost. So Washington was a deist. They rejected the Trinity, basically, the Christian Trinity. They believed in one God.
Right.
Washington didn't talk about it, but it's there. In fact, a very prominent conservative, religious conservative intellectual who had begun himself as a Protestant and became a Catholic, Michael Novak. I won't go through the whole story, but he and I became friends because he was the one assigned to interview me on Sunday evening on Book TV, C-SPAN's Book TV, for my book, Thomas Paine and the Promise of America. And I was sweating at the idea that he was going to interview me. One, because he was an important figure. That in itself is a little daunting. Two, because he was a conservative, which meant was he going to just come after me and Thomas Paine, basically. And the third thing is that I did not want to talk about religion. I want to talk about democracy and revolution and those kinds of things. So I came to DC for the taping, and my daughter happened to be on an internship there that summer. She and I went to the C-SPAN studios, and I was there first. But on the way there, I made sure to do something. At Dulles Airport, I bought an American flag pin. That was in the time when everyone was, do you display the flag? Do you not display the flag? This was like 1985. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. So, sorry, I'm lying. That was my other book. Sorry,
I was
2005.
about to say, I thought I
No,
was
no, no,
pretty
no,
sure I was
no.
about to say
Right.
this is early
No,
2000s
absolutely
for
no, no. I
readers. I think it
apologize.
came out in
I apologize.
2002.
It's 2000. This is 2005. Okay,
Okay.
2005. So I'm waiting, and so I bought the pin. Also, I made it a point of buying one of his books before I ever got to DC, which actually was fairly interesting. I don't always agree with. I wouldn't have agreed with it, but it was interesting. So I'm sitting in the green room, as they call it, waiting for him. And when he comes in with the producer, who I had already met and had escorted me in, first thing he said, which caught me completely off guard, is, "Harvey K, I've been so eager to meet you." He said, "because you realize that Thomas Paine did believe in God." But then also, and I said, and he was known for working on Washington and other things. Then I said, well, and then he said, he made it clear that he generally agreed with me that Washington did not believe in the Trinity, that Washington was essentially a deist as well. And yeah, so he and I kind of became friends from that, which is curious because you don't confess to too many people you were friends with Michael Novak, at least not in the past. He's passed away since then. So Paine was a deist.
Well, and if I can just jump in, because I hope that this isn't, oversimplifying thing, but I seem to remember from middle school or high school civics
Yeah.
or history and all this that deism, it's kind of the idea that also that God isn't taking an active part in all of our little
Right.
things. It's the
Right.
watchmaker. He set the
Right.
watch together and set it all in motion,
As
which
as
is
a deist would have said, God is perfection. And if God creates something, then God has created something perfect and does not require is not required, or
mm,
but they would have said he if they had to
right.
interfere. Okay. The main thing is, and then the question, well, where is God? And Paine actually said in a what I'll get to, he had an explanation for that, which is actually not too far off from what the astronomers now tell us. But here we go. So he he was a deist, but as I said, sorry, I'm jumping all over the place here. I got so much stuff going around in my head. I just
It's
love talking.
okay, and we have time to disentangle
Well, the
it.
main thing is,
So
so we've already talked about rights of man, but while he's there, he's going to write again a two-part book, or what you would call two pamphlets that would compose a book, called The Age of Reason. And what he does in this book is he is trying to defend God against the Jacobins in France. The Jacobins are setting up in the French Revolution their own religion. They've literally tried to drive the Catholic Church out. They've carried out a number of, sort of attacks on Catholic Church and their monasteries and stuff. But they want to create a religion. And I think it was called the Temple of Reason, something like that. And Paine, first, I didn't believe in religious persecution to start with, but most important is that the whole idea of a state religion was so anathema to him. It was a horrific thought to him. Plus, he wanted to defend the idea that God did exist. However, he also wanted to make it clear that he thought all the organized religions that claimed to speak for God's intentions and God's thoughts basically didn't know what they were talking about because nobody had ever talked to God. Okay. The Bible was written by human beings, not by God, blah, blah, blah. Now,
right.
so he said, if you really want to understand God, what you have to do is appreciate the earth and the universe he's created for us. Okay. And in doing so, we also come to see what our role in life is. Just as he gave us this incredible gift, it's our responsibility to be gracious and generous and, embracing of others. I mean, he said, I believe in God. And my goal is to do right, to do good, basically, as he put it. And even the political things he was doing was with that in mind, because he wanted to make sure that there were no state churches. But he would never have said we have to persecute believers or anything like that, because he was a deist.
Right. And there's a gulf of difference there. And I think sometimes, like right now in our modern discourse, has been very intentionally blurred between that line of like, well, we're a Christian nation and you want to persecute all the Christians. Like somehow there's a big wide middle ground there where no, we're not actually, we don't have a state religion, and everyone can practice and should be able to practice without fear however they practice their faith,
Right.
right? Which will
Yeah.
come up again, I'm sure, as we get up to
Yeah. Well, and so
like Social Security and the
right,
four freedoms and
right.
all of this.
Well,
So
and as a matter of fact, and this is the key thing in that, is that Paine didn't even believe we should think in terms of toleration. Toleration assumes that we have in some way the power or authority to not tolerate.
right.
I mean, the point is, in
It's interesting you bring that up because I didn't know that before this conversation, but I wrote an essay some years ago, and I think it's titled something like Christians aren't called to tolerate, we're called to love our neighbor. It's like very simple what
yes,
Jesus's words are there.
fair enough.
It's not
Fair enough.
put up
Right.
with them.
Okay. So Paine writes The Age of Reason, and he attacks organized religions and the Bible. Okay, he wants to take it down from what. Now, keep in mind, this is a guy who knows the Bible by heart himself. Just it's
Right.
that that whereas Rights of Man became a huge bestseller in Europe and again here in America, and brought him all the more fame as this truly revolutionary Democrat and radical, thinker and so on. The Age of Reason brought him scorn. Okay. And to give you an example, although I've already said Washington, Jefferson, and Franklin definitely were deists. Okay. Samuel Adams, who was close to Thomas Paine during the Revolutionary years, actually wrote a scathing letter to him, saying, how dare, it's like he's shocked that this man that he was so close to has, in essence, come out as a deist and denied, God and the Trinity or whatever it might well have been. So, okay. And then he also writes then a second volume, but the main thing, the points are the same basically in the second pamphlet or second volume that goes into making up The Age of Reason. That will become, if you like, one of the things that will lead not just religious people, not just clergy, but also folks who just literally were looking for a damn good excuse to go after Thomas Paine. They will use that, and they will literally promote stories that you'll go to hell if you read Thomas Paine. Okay, it's that kind of stuff. Now, along the way, I should point out that he was arrested. Did I discuss that? Because he had
I
voted. Did I say that he had voted against executing the king and queen
in
when he was in?
France?
Yes. Okay. So
No,
sorry.
yeah, no, I don't think we talked about that
Okay,
yet.
because he had
So
escaped to France. That we did know, right? Or not? Did I?
yes,
And he's in
yes,
France, and he was elected to the National Assembly. But and by the way, for what it's worth, he couldn't speak French, so everything had to be translated for him in the deliberations. He voted to convict the king of treason, but when the vote came up as to executing the king or not, he voted no, because he did not believe in capital punishment. And he made it clear that there was an alternative. The alternative, he doesn't even know if the words that he was offering were translated. He argued, send the king to America. It would be like a re-education in public life. Let him go to America and learn about a republican order, so to speak, as in form of government. Well, the Jacobins hated him for doing this, hated him, and as a consequence, not long after, they order his arrest and execution. Now, this is interesting. He escapes death. He's in prison. They used to turn old hotels into prisons. He's in this hotel, and the room or cell that he's in, he shared with two other men, who I believe one of them was from maybe Holland, and the other they used the term Holland in those days, Holland
Right.
or Denmark, something like that. And I believe at least one of them was a doctor. And the way it worked is this: if you've been ordered for execution, or basically you're going to be executed, is they would send around the night before a guard or a staff or somebody close to the executioner to mark the door, to mark the door um, with, I don't know what the maybe put an X on it or something like that, which would tell them that there's somebody in here. They had the name, somebody in there was due to be executed.
Right.
But these cells, rooms, they had, I believe they had the cell on the outside, cell door, and then there's the inner door. The point is that when they came around to mark the door, the two other men, Paine was very sick in prison. He was very sick. The two other men persuaded the guard to leave open one of the doors. So when they came around to mark, they had marked the inner door with
Okay.
the sign of the executioner. So overnight, that door was open, and the next morning, the door was closed. And so when they came to collect the condemned, they couldn't see the mark. He survived.
Wow.
Now, it's worth noting that one of Paine's political enemies was a man named Gouverneur Morris. And I'm not going to go into the whole story as to why he was. He was a very wealthy lawyer and merchant who sort of moved back and forth between New York and Philadelphia. But he had lost a leg below the knee, or at least the lower part of his leg. So I believe he had what we used to call a peg leg, like a pirate. But he was very significant in the course of the Revolution and the Constitution, the writing of the Constitution. In fact, I believe that he was the one who insisted that in the preamble it says "we the people" and not the states are put. No, so it's the people who are putting the Constitution together, not the states.
Right.
And that's
Right.
significant because in the Civil War, that was Lincoln's argument that no states had the right to withdraw. It's the people who created the nation, not states. Anyhow, so Gouverneur Morris was what you would call, he became a Federalist. Okay. And he became the ambassador to France from the United States, Washington's ambassador to France. He hated Paine. And Paine protested to the French that he should not be imprisoned because he's an American. Morris said he's not American, he's English, which is Morris's way of saying, fuck him, kill him, right?
Right.
Which they then failed to do. Luckily for Paine, he was replaced, Morris, by James Monroe. And Monroe, who had been a very young man at the time of the Revolution, he was enamored of Paine and his ideas, and he fought to get Paine released from prison. And then he and his wife took Paine into their residence in Paris for him to recover. I think he spent 2 years with them, in fact. But it's interesting that Paine came to believe that Washington had abandoned him because Morris had done nothing to get him out. We don't know if Morris even ever told Washington. This is one
Right.
of those things about, two friends who
Well,
were
and
not
it's not like Washington was opening up the Drudge Report or whatever and seeing Thomas Paine had been arrested. The lines of communication were
right. Yeah.
that line of communication.
And on top of that, by the way, is the fact that when Paine is released and living with Monroe, he writes a scathing long letter to Washington that's published in one of the Jeffersonian, what they call the Republican newspapers in Philadelphia. It is slamming of Washington. It goes all the way back to the Revolution and takes him apart for his generalship. I mean, it's awful. And Washington was probably rather upset by that, but the Federalists grabbed hold of this as another reason to hate Thomas Paine. Just, it's all piling up, right?
Right.
So eventually, as we know, Jefferson, oh, sorry, before I get there, now we get to the key thing. The reason I think you invited me to come on, by the way, when Paine is released, he authors a pamphlet, which which in many ways he had always intended to write, but now he returns to the theme that he was going to write a long time before. This is a pamphlet entitled Agrarian Justice. Now, in Rights of Man, Paine laid out what we would think of if I could even, in fact, let me do that. I want to read to you because this is now to get to the thing you really wanted to get to on this.
Yeah, perfect. And crowd applause, agrarian justice while you pull that up.
Okay,
Yes.
first, this is Rights of Man. This is Rights of Man first, because
Right.
it's the way to agrarian justice.
All right.
In Rights of Man Part 2, he lays out what we would call a social democratic vision. My argument would be there were many who had authored communist visions going, all the way back to the Middle Ages. This is the first social democratic vision. Paine extended his radical democratic thinking by outlining a series of welfare programs that a revolutionary change in British government would afford. In other words, if you get rid of the king and the aristocracy, all the money that's basically enabling them to live high in the hog, the taxes that come out of the people, could now be devoted to the people. Along with suggesting a progressive estate tax to limit the accumulation of property, Paine recommended raising the incomes of the poor by returning their taxes to them and augmenting the sums, distributing special relief for families with children, creating a system of Social Security for the elderly, instituting public funding of educational opportunities, providing financial support for newly married couples and new mothers, and establishing employment centers for the jobless. Okay? And then he says in that same moment, he offers a vision of a good society. When it shall be said in any country in the world, quote, my poor are happy, neither ignorance nor distress is to be found among them. My jails are empty of prisoners, my streets of beggars, the aged are not in want, the taxes are not oppressive, the rational world is my friend, because I am a friend of happiness. When these things can be said, then a country can boast of its constitution and its government. So he's now moving from what previously was, by the way, a belief that he never uses the term capitalism. That's not a word that's emerged yet, even though Adam Smith is writing around at the very same time.
Right.
And
He's
right. In fact,
contemporaneous to this.
Smith and Paine, I believe, had become friendly when Paine returned to
Oh,
Britain.
interesting.
Okay. So, but Paine had believed before that free trade and free commerce were the basis upon which all could benefit. That was his original thought. But his return to Britain and France showed him just how civilization led to poverty. He was and the word, when he uses civilization as a word, it's essentially capitalism, the political economic order.
Right.
So he's come to believe that it's essential that government be harnessed to prevent poverty and to enable people to rise out of poverty. So this is important. Keep in mind, he's a deist. And remember what I said, that he believed that the earth and the universe were created for humanity. So now, later, when he's writing Agrarian Justice, what he says is, look, and I'll also point out, he wrote Agrarian Justice in response to an English minister, not government minister, a reverend, okay, giving some sermon that got published and spread about, in which he claimed, as Jesus said, the poor will always be with us.
Right.
And that God made rich and poor alike. And Paine says, no, he didn't. No, he didn't. God would not do that. It's civilization that creates rich and poor. Now, if God created the world for all of us to enjoy, that means if any people, and he's got in mind here the landed aristocracy and rich landlords in particular, if any people are able to monopolize the earth, meaning the land, then they owe the rest of us a tax. They owe the rest of us a payment. So he's not yet calling for dispossessing them of their land. He says you can't really take the land directly from them because they may have invested much of their own labor and much of their own resources into it. But that still doesn't change the fact they owe us. They owe us. By the
Right.
way, I read a
The
very
land
interesting.
stock has been removed from all of the rest of us.
Right. I read an interesting article and it may well be true. This guy made the argument that Paine was not trying to say, yeah, let them, they can keep the land. What he's trying to say is, if you don't do what I'm about to suggest, we're going to take it. That was the underlying idea. Okay.
The
So what does he say?
implication.
He says what needs to happen is that these people pay, for lack of a better term, I'll say a tax on their accumulated property. The tax will go into a national fund, call it a treasury if you like, out of which he referred before to Social Security, out of which men and women, when they reach a certain age, will start to receive payments. In other words, they should be able to not have to work in that same way any longer. And there's the age he suggests for that is 50 years old. Keep in mind, life expectancy, it was totally different then. So
Right.
when people reach the age of seniority of 50, they should be entitled to these payments from the fund that the rich have paid into by the fact that they owe us, basically. But he said, moreover, because he says that's to prevent the poor, the elderly from sliding into poverty. He was so concerned because he had experienced poverty himself a number of times. He said at the same time that fund should pay young people, boys and girls, are now achieving manhood and womanhood, when they reach the age of 21, a payment, a lump sum that will enable them to get a start in life. So we would say, buy land themselves, set up in a business or trade, or get an education, whatever it is, that this would give them a propulsion to succeed and to avoid falling into poverty. Now, Paine makes something clear. This is really important. We talk about means testing. The term
Yep.
probably didn't exist yet. He lays out an argument against means testing. He said, at no point should these payments ever be viewed as a charity. These are rightful payments. Moreover, to make sure that it's understood to be rightful, nobody can turn them down. So if you think you've got more money than you need and the government's about to give you a payment, it doesn't matter. You have to take it.
Right. It's part of
But
your rights of
right,
being in this society.
right.
Everybody in, nobody out.
You can, by the way, he said, you can give it back. You can make a donation to the government, but you're not making a donation of a charitable sort. You're just saying, here, you can take it back. But first, you have to accept it. It's a duty and an obligation. So here it's Thomas Paine. This is like 17. I want to get the year right. 17. I had it right in front of me, the date. It's late 1790s, but what date is it exactly? Oh, well. Oh, yeah, 1795. Thank you. 1795. He's laying out a vision in Rights of Man of a social democratic polity. And here in Agrarian Justice, he's really laying out a truly extraordinary social security system. Now, of course, we put a cap on incomes. We put a cap on how much social security tax can affect your income, right? We'd say over a certain amount, you don't have to pay additional sums.
Right. Exactly.
But his argument today would be bullshit. You make more, you pay more. Okay. So anyhow,
everyone should pay at the same rate.
He really was the visionary of social democracy in the modern world. Absolutely. So he's the visionary of democratic republics, at least in the American sense. Okay. He's the visionary of social democracy. And in some ways, the Economic Bill of Rights that Alan Mint, the 21st century, that FDR proposed, that others after him proposed and updated, that Alan Minsky and I are promoting, that you have taken, and secured the embrace of the West Virginia Democratic Party for. This has its origins, you might say, in Thomas Paine's radical vision. And, and by the way, I will tell you, it did have a real impact on politics, and say didn't create anything at that time, but it did become something that was not itself forgotten either. But it's
Right.
also because
Well,
of
and
that. Sorry, one last thing. Because of that,
go ahead.
you can imagine the landed rich, whether they're European or British or American. It's one more reason to hate Thomas Paine. What? They want me to pay taxes, and nobody else is going to be paying taxes, but the landed, hey, hell with that. So,
Well, and especially in America where, we have just 1795 is 6 years after the ratification of the Constitution, during which time you know, I think we've talked about this before, not on this program, but in general. Um, my view of the U.S. Constitution and the promise of America is very much that, man, it is a revolutionary document. It changes the course of world history in many ways. It is also very flawed in two key ways. One of them being that we said that your personhood is basically proportional to the property that you own, and then the other
actually,
aspect.
that is not in the Constitution. I'm going to make it very clear. It's not in the Constitution. State constitutions, yes. The U.S. Constitution does not create, first, it doesn't set up the rules for voting or anything else. But the other thing
Right.
is, there is no, in terms of people get men getting elected to office, there's no religious test or property requirement. Just let's be clear about that.
Right.
States
No, but
add that.
what I'm particularly referring to is, first of all, the 3/5 compromise. I mean, that's
Oh,
really, and
right.
that's the
Sure.
second part of that being that the more people you own, the more property you have, the more, of a census voice that you have. And
That's
yes, I mean,
yes,
it's,
that's true. I'm sorry. In that sense,
and yeah,
I'm not
and
defending
downstream from that.
slaveholders. No.
Right, exactly. And that's the entire tension of American history, in my opinion, is that because so much of the economy was dependent on, and the northern economy too, right? I mean, that we can act like the northerners were all absolutely there was all this
Well,
opposition to slavery,
actually,
but
I'm not going to get into the argument now about. I don't subscribe to the 1619 project. Okay, I think it's terribly
okay.
flawed. And in fact, the northern economies in the days we're talking about, Constitution, et cetera, were essentially, and these are mostly agrarian folks. Yeah, they were merchants, but this was not yet industrial revolution going on in America.
Right. No, that's true, but there is a lot of trade going through
Absolutely, undeniable.
the
But the northern
yeah.
colonies were not not as of
I think,
yeah.
yeah, I absolutely, and I don't want to overstate the case at that at all. But the point being, the point that I'm trying to get to is that at this point we have ratified a constitution, and the states have set up these mechanisms that basically are privileging the propertied class,
Absolutely, because I was going to say,
in effect, and
and
all
they
for all.
actually included property requirements for voting in many places, which is why, and I'll
Right.
get to it in a little while, Paine's influence persists. And go ahead.
And that's exactly where I wanted to kind of lead to, is that it was a radical vision, and why didn't it immediately result in the same sort of revolutionary thought that Paine's first writings in America resulted in? And I think it's the course of history. The Constitution had been ratified. We had already gone through this problem of the Articles of Confederacy, and
Yeah, of
and also
Confederation.
we had
Confederation.
just
Yeah.
narrowly avoided our first constitutional crisis, which was, one of them was that was resolved, was a tension between the Fugitive Slave Act between Virginia and Pennsylvania, and required George Washington to get down to write to the governors and go figure this out, because otherwise we're going to have this is going to the Supreme Court. And they ended up amending the damn thing and solving it without, or no, they didn't amend it. They resolved that particular issue, so it did not have to go
Yeah.
further. But this is what's going on. There is already fractures and tensions and all this, and I would think, and I'm not an expert in really any portion of history, but um, I would think that there's just no appetite to go back to the drawing board and try to implement these things laid out in the Agrarian Justice. Um, that would be my hypothesis for both why we didn't get immediate outcomes from that, and also to the point that I think we're going to that you started the question with is why was this concerted effort to basically bury and besmirch Paine's legacy?
Right.
He's taking on the powerful interests in America that were there before the Constitution and have coalesced in the
Right. So for 200 years,
ratification.
truly, believe me, for 200 years, from even before Paine got back to the United States in 1801, 1802, when Jefferson was president, all the way through, all the way through to the time, as I think I may have said last time, of Roosevelt's presidency. Jefferson at one end, Roosevelt at the other, Franklin Roosevelt.
Right.
Those are the presidents who spoke of Paine positively. In between, then, no president in office spoke positively of Thomas Paine. Okay. In fact, what's interesting is I did mention Lincoln's affection for Paine's stuff. Did I not or not? I've done over the
I
years.
don't think
Okay.
not in this conversations. I don't think
Now,
we
let
have.
me jump to this thing. As much as okay, so the elites tried to suppress his memory. They failed. I thought I and every other historian, until literally the most innovative argument in my work ever probably is the revelation that Paine had not been forgotten ever in American history, and in fact influenced and pushed at the American story even when he's dead. His very memory does that. Let me explain. So I'm going to read to you a list of the movements because we don't have the time to go through the whole history. These are the movements that in the course of American history, as they emerge, they too want to lay claim to the American promise and the American story. They would reach back to the time of the Revolution. So yeah, they would talk about Jefferson, Washington, even Adams, depending on which state they were in. New Englanders love to talk about Adams, Virginians and Southerners, Jefferson. The point is that every progressive movement, I use that with a small p, progressive movement, okay, rediscovers Paine and makes him one of their champions, one of their heroes. That is at least half of what this book does. It retells the American story by way of Paine's presence through American history. Now, so listen to this. This includes working men's advocates. So they were the working men's parties that were set up to change the constitutions of their states or the laws that prevailed regarding who had the right to vote because property kept all too many working men from having the right to vote. I haven't mentioned women yet. First, working men's advocates. Two, abolitionists. Three, free thinkers. Four, suffragists. Five, anarchists, populists, socialists, progressives with a capital P, labor and community organizers, peace activists, and liberals. Oh, I don't have it listed here because socialist is a broad term, but even communists in the 30s and the 40s and so on, Thomas Paine. Every single progressive movement, right from the start through, embraced Paine. Now, when I wrote the book, I couldn't seem to find evidence that the civil rights movement had embraced Paine, which was very frustrating. But my explanation for that was that because so much of the civil rights movement is church based, that they too were not going to embrace a deist. Okay. However,
Right.
I discovered after the book appeared that that Martin Luther King Jr. in one of his books in the it has to be the 1960s. You'll excuse me. Where do we go from here? Might be the book that whenever he would become despondent about the state of the civil rights movement, like when he came north and discovered the animosities, antagonisms, and hatreds, the racism that prevailed in the streets of Chicago.
Right.
But also when Black Power emerges, and he is seriously concerned that Black Power is actually a threat to the civil rights movement. Okay, he apparently he turned to Thomas Paine, and he would remind himself of Paine's words from Common Sense. We have it in our power to begin the world over again. That is, that which is doesn't have to be this way. We have it in our power to make it otherwise. And I discovered this also because there was forget his first name, a professor of theology out at the University of Denver, I believe, who was close, a black theologian who was close to King, and he introduces King's book by talking about how King really did hold on to Paine's words at moments where he really needed inspiration, which is interesting to think. Okay, so unfortunately that didn't make it into my book, but I've often thought that I should go back and just do a. I try to get the publishers of the Thomas Paine book to give me a shot at the 40th anniversary edition where I'd have a preface where I could bring it up to date, but they weren't prepared to do that. The book's still in print and it's still doing very well. Okay, and if people are interested in this stuff, there it is, Thomas Paine and the Promise of America. And I can tell you, I originally intended to write a book in which I was only going to talk about the suppression of Thomas Paine's memory. It was going to be, maybe I didn't mention this, it was going to be his life, his labors, and the suppression of his memory. Closing with, I was going to bring him back to life and have a conversation with him in print. Okay, what he would make of America today. And then when I got into doing the research, that I was literally floored. Okay, people knew about the working men's parties, maybe even up to abolition, but no one had really discovered the degree to which Paine was never ever forgotten, even though the elites kept him out of a lot of textbooks. Okay, he was never mentioned on big July 4th occasions. Now I even discovered that his bridge idea was quoted sometimes in the mid 19th century when people wanted to build a bridge across a river that had kept communications limited. And they would sort of refer to Thomas Paine's first efforts at building a bridge. I mean, astounding. I can tell you that every writer, historian of history, a writer of history, probably hopes that they're going to come across something that breaks everyone's understanding or changes everyone's understanding. And I honestly believe, that's the one thing I can brag about, that this book restores Thomas Paine.
Um, as you're talking about all the different, it's like he was a folk hero all the time, but not, in the textbooks, not on the covers of a textbook, not the George Washington cutting down an apple tree type mythologizing about him or anything like this, but people were aware of him and people talked about him within their own movements, it sounds like.
Yeah, right. Well, I'll give you
Throughout the entire history that you're talking
right.
about.
Two little stories or vignettes or whatever. One, Theodore Roosevelt wrote a biography of Gouverneur Morris, the figure I referred to before.
Uh-huh.
Okay. And in that biography, Roosevelt refers to Thomas Paine as a filthy little atheist. Well, I've already explained he wasn't an atheist. Paine was
Right.
not filthy. And he was not little for the day. He was either 5'9" or 5'10", which in the late 18th century was actually a pretty good height. There were taller people. Jefferson and Washington were taller, but that doesn't matter. It's like most of the others were shorter. Okay.
Right.
Okay, that's first. Well, then, um, in 1942, the outset of 42, Roosevelt, Franklin, his cousin, Franklin, who's now been president for 8 years, he goes before the nation in the wake of the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 41. And he basically calls on Washington's birthday weekend, he calls on Paine's memory and talks about Paine and the Crisis Papers, which I didn't talk a great deal about, in which Paine says, these are the times that try men's souls. And Roosevelt quotes Paine as speaking the voice of America, basically. That America too is now at one of those moments in its war with the fascists, Japan and Germany. This is so that's where Paine is brought back into the presidential discourse, you might say. But I can tell you that even then the conservatives would have nothing to do with Paine. I mean, I could tell you story upon story about this. I mean, it really was amazing. So when he does that, there is a volume, Letters to the President. This volume was put together by a really well-known historian. And Roosevelt received tens of thousands of letters probably in the course of his presidency. The point is that in this is a letter from a writer in like Kansas, something like this, that says, I was so glad to hear you talk about Thomas Paine and use his words as you did. And it's all the more important because it was another Roosevelt, basically, who had the indecency of dismissing Paine in awful language, that kind of thing. So yeah, it was. I mean, this mattered to a lot of people, and in 1960, did I mention the Barry Goldwater connection in this? Do you know who Barry Goldwater
No.
was? Oh, you
Yeah,
don't know who
I do.
Goldwater is?
Yeah.
Of course you do.
No, I do know who Goldwater is.
Okay,
You hadn't
right.
mentioned the connection, just to be
Okay.
clear.
Yes. Okay. So Barry Goldwater, who was the Republican nominee in 1964, who was the first truly conservative, viewed as the sort of the new right. He was the first of what we would think of as the new right, except he
Right.
was not actually new right because he would have nothing to do with the religious conservatives. He despised the moral majority, folks. Okay. He just did. Okay. But in
Right.
1964, it's the Republican National Convention. And the day of the convention, Goldwater says, basically, he says, I cannot use this acceptance address speech that he had written along with some other people. He said, this is awful. So one of his chief aides says, I know we need to bring in Harry Jaffa, who was a professor of political science and maybe on the law at either Ohio State or Ohio University. Harry Jaffa by the way, thereafter came to be renowned as one of the leading figures of conservative thought in America. Goldwater asked him would he write a speech for him. So I interviewed this guy, Harry Jaffa, because I wanted to know where did he get Paine's words,
Right.
and this is what happened. Okay, this is interesting. Jaffa goes to Bartlett's quotations. By the way, here's the line. It's the most famous line in Goldwater's speech. It was drawn out of Thomas Paine. And the line it's actually one of the most famous line in American political history. It's extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice.
Uh-huh.
That's drawn from a pamphlet that Paine wrote when he had gone, I believe, back to England, when Franklin said, go back to Europe to get endorsements and money for your bridge idea. Paine was writing about the right to vote and other things. And he says, moderation in temper is always a good. Moderation in principle is a vice. Meaning, don't if you have principles, don't be moderate about your principles. I could find the quote, but I
Right.
hope you
Yeah.
get the idea. So I don't even, I mean, I can't tell you, did Goldwater know that he was using Paine's words? I don't know, but I can tell you this, Jaffa knew. Of course he knew. And so when I interviewed him, Jaffa didn't know my politics when I interviewed him. I got to him by way of this friend of mine who was one of the editors at the Weekly Standard, the Bill Kristol, Rupert Murdoch funded magazine. He got me all the speechwriters for these conservatives, the names, and I could contact them. So I interviewed all of Reagan's speechwriters, almost all of them, and I interviewed Harry Jaffa for Goldwater. And so I interviewed him, and we had a long conversation. It was actually a great conversation. I thanked him in my book on Thomas Paine, by the way. I don't know how he felt about it once he realized my politics, but he said to me, well, it's not that I'm a student of Thomas Paine, but I do admire him, and he laid out all the good things about it. But I have to tell you, it's not that I even remembered Paine's words. I went to Bartlett's quotations He discovered Paine's words in Bartlett's quotations and then took it out and changed them for Barry Goldwater's speech. Yeah,
And the historic irony being that Thomas Paine was butting heads with Edmund Burke, who is the father of modern conservatism, who you would
right.
expect in a Barry Goldwater speech.
Yes, exactly. And in fact, when Ronald Reagan started quoting Thomas Paine in his 1980 campaign for president, George Will, the columnist,
Uh-huh.
historically with the Washington Post, no longer, I believe, has, driven out, so to speak, by even he got driven out by Bezos. So George Will wrote a column after Reagan gave his his acceptance speech, sorry, at the Republican convention. In his acceptance speech, Reagan quoted three heroes of the working class: Lincoln, Paine, Lincoln, Roosevelt. Yeah, Roosevelt. And George Will said, "What kind of conservative is quoting Thomas Paine and Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt?" It was terribly upsetting to him. But Reagan was smart. Reagan knew. He said he was gonna command the history, and he was gonna quote the very folks that might appeal to working people and to even to
Right.
Democrats who were so fed up with Carter.
Right.
So
Well, and at that, I mean, in 1980, we have, you had mentioned before that Barry Goldwater was not with the moral majority, found them repugnant. And in 1980, we have really the coalescence of those various factions in the Republican Party. And it really sets us in motion up through today in a lot of ways.
yeah, one
In
last
most
thing.
ways, I mean.
One last thing I would say is
Go ahead.
in the early 1930s. Okay, so there was a, I think it still exists. If not, it's too bad. There was a very, very prominent Catholic magazine. And I believe it was in the Catholic magazine that they thanked Thomas Paine for calling for the separation of church and state because the Catholics appreciated the fact that the Protestants could not could not try to suppress the Catholic Church in the United States, and they traced it back to Thomas Paine, which I thought was pretty magnanimous of them, to,
Yeah.
to finally
Well,
to
and like,
finally to finally embrace Thomas Paine. So along the way, there were all of these things. He was never forgotten, however much they tried to suppress his memory.
yeah,
When
and
I was
I
interviewing,
don't.
when I was sorry,
It makes sense to me
yeah,
because when you're talking about Social Security, I think you're
yeah,
immediately adjacent to
right,
Catholic social teaching and the whole thing. I think both Pope Francis and Pope Leo are. There's not much in there aside from the deism aspect, the theological things.
yeah,
Uh,
right,
the everything else. And I think there's something to that of like you can come to these conclusions through any number of ways, and this is pre-Marxism, so there's no way to say
right,
that, oh, a property tax is a wealth tax and a state tax, all these things are Marxist. It
yeah,
literally predates it all, and it is closer to what Adam Smith was writing about in The Wealth of Nations and all of this, because Adam Smith was a moralist. He wasn't an
yeah.
economist, you
One of the
know.
truly another guy who's been radically misinterpreted. I mean, the guy was
Yes.
really not. He was no socialist, Adam Smith. Let's be careful. Nor was
No,
this.
no, no. But
But he
there's
was seriously worried about the implications of industrial capitalism and what it would do to people.
Yeah, and he was no fan of landlords. And when he talked about
Oh,
economic
because
waste,
the
he was,
landlords were aristocrats. They were
yep,
unproductive.
exactly. And that's the type of waste that, when we talk about
Mhm.
economically, we're actually like, I see it everywhere. And, just to kind of wrap it around, one of the places when I was talking with Nancy Altman and talking about how, you take this estate tax, you create Social Security for old age, you create a fund for people starting out in life. And how completely opposite is it today where people start out with life with thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars of student debt that in my mind is just sheer economic waste after a certain point. The professors have been paid, the buildings are built, the classes, you can't repossess an education, and all it's doing is servicing interest to go and die in Wall Street.
And it is essentially, excuse the term,
Usury. No, sorry.
handicapping and or disabling, whichever term you prefer, young people from going
Yeah.
on to succeed. Okay,
Yep.
because they can't go on to further education. They can't go on to even imagine buying a home. I mean, it literally stymies them, and therefore it stymies the economy.
Oh hell.
They,
And
they, you have to ask
let's
yourself, this is the note I want to end on. What kills me is that we waste history. Anyone who knows anything about history should realize that the middle class was created not simply because the values were right, but because FDR created an order out of the Depression by way of the New Deal in alignment with labor, which persisted and was enhanced indeed by the war effort, though we didn't need a war to necessarily do it. It was already underway with the New Deal. And
right.
then the GI Bill empowered a generation of young men and women, but especially young men. Admittedly, there was a lot of evidence of discrimination because it was often, driven by people on the ground who had their own ideas as to whether blacks should get
Right.
what whites get. But the fact is, how do you think the 30s to the 70s were these dynamic? Yeah, everyone says, okay, the 30s, depression, they just list them. But the arc from the 30s to the 70s was one of, excuse the term, redemption, advancement, and extraordinary growth and development.
Absolutely. And it's was policy choices. It wasn't coincidence. And the erosion of the middle class today is a set of policy choices. It's not coincidence.
Absolutely.
But that period between the 30s and the 70s wasn't just the most prosperous time in America, but if you zero in on Appalachia, on West Virginia, those were the times that we had just burgeoning population. And yeah, there was a large demand for coal, but it was also the wealth was more getting shared to the workers before such time. And the coal fields in West Virginia are, you can see, we forget our history. You're right. We can see what happened when automation and surface mining and mountaintop removal mining all became the standard. Lots of tens of thousands of miners lost their jobs in the course of 20 years. Before Reagan left office, most of the coal jobs in West Virginia
Yeah.
had been destroyed. And with that, we went from having 6 representatives to now having 2 because our population has dwindled while everyone else has grown. And all of this goes directly to policy decisions. Now, I will say, the Democrats who were running the state in the 20th century mismanaged the wealth that was flying out of the state,
Yeah.
and didn't capture it and didn't enough redistribute it out to the people such that when those bust cycles came, people had to leave. That's the
Yeah.
reality of it. In any case, it's a great place to end on, and maybe next it also sets up for a great conversation next time to talk more about FDR and the New Deal and what truly made the greatest generation great, which a fantastic book again I have sitting here heavily earmarked, and
Thank you.
ready to discuss at next time we come on. The book we've been discussing today is Thomas Paine and the Promise of America. The guest has been Professor Harvey J. Kaye. Thank you so much again for your time, for all of your insight, for all of the research that goes into this, and for continuing to spread the good word about Thomas Paine.
And I want to thank you because of these terrible years we've been experiencing. You have been one of the brightest spots in my political universe.
You're too
I,
kind.
what you accomplished, I know I helped mentor it, but what you accomplished in West Virginia when the history books get written, I hope people remember that you were the one who led, sorry, I shouldn't tell you that way, who encouraged your colleagues in the Democratic
Shepherded.
Party, shepherded, to basically redeem the state of West Virginia and hopefully the United States.
Well, any credit I can take for that, I stand on the shoulders of giants. It started at the very least with Thomas Paine and go back all along the line. None of it is in isolation. And again, you're too kind, but I appreciate it. And Until next time, Harvey, thank you
You
so
bet.
much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.